While Patchy puts himself together, let's see how Spongebob's party is shaping up. Meanwhile, 2 hours later, 8:01 p.m. the next day. Later, 20 minutes later, 6 hours later, several bad puns later. Meanwhile, 6 hours later that same evening, several days later, 6 months later, 2 hours later, 46 weeks later, 1 minute 37 seconds later, 1 dip to society later, 1 pair of pants later, 8 hours later, 298,000 patties later, 3 hours later, epilogue. The next day, meanwhile at the Krusty Krab, 10 seconds later, 346 minutes later, much later, 3 days later, opening night, later, 3,000 years later, 1 week later, 7:59 a.m., 3 weeks later, 3 days later, 2 hours later, 48 hours later, 8 hours later, the following Thursday, 5 minutes later, 24 hours later, much later, much later, 7 hours later, epilogue, several song-filled hours later, a few minutes later, a little longer than a few minutes later, 2 hours later, 3 days later, 15 minutes later, several months later, thousands of tears later, 60 paranoia-filled days later, 2 hours later, much later, yesterday, many hours later, 75 years later, 2 hours later, 1 extremely annoying shift later, 2 very boring minutes later, 3 hours later, 1 wiener later, the following day. Meanwhile, later, just fit. What follows is a brief construction montage. We hope you enjoyed this brief construction montage. Meanwhile, back in the lowlands, 1 frozen wasteland later, 1 hour later, 5 hours later, 2 days later, later in the void, approximately 10 hours later, early the next morning, 1 shift later, 2 weeks later, 11 minutes later, 5 minutes later, a lot of boring math later, 24 hours later, 1 week later, 1 long angry line later,